The ledger stopped mid-sentence and Marin let out a sound that was part surprise, part warning. Suspicion tightened Elias Hargrove's chest before he had time to name it. He moved his chair closer and laid a gloved hand on the table, as if the page might still be warm. Marin's thumb hovered over the trailing ink. "Look," she said, and the word carried the late, evening hush of the archive with it. That first moment contained the central problem, a formal record that ends without closure, a chain of custody broken in plain ink, and an immediate need to know why. Elias had catalogued dozens of ledgers in the last 30 years. He knew the weight of a single ledger entry, the way a date and a line could stand for a person's whole week. He slid his spectacles down his nose and read the last visible words aloud so the silence could answer. He read the name, the date, and the fragment of a sentence that stopped as though the writer had left the room. Elias, Marin. And the sound in her voice turned his suspicion toward action. He reached for his brass pocket watch, checked the time, and set the lamp closer to see the paper fibers. They were at the worktable under a brass lamp. The donated box had been a late arrival on a Monday cart, a battered tin trunk wrapped in old twine and labeled with a hand that matched the ledger's header. Marin had opened the ledger without intending drama. She had been doing inventory. The ink stroke that stopped across the page was fresh enough that Elias could still see the hallow where the nib had lifted. He felt doubt shift within him, doubt about whether someone had tampered, or whether the ledger's last keeper had simply been interrupted. Marin nudged the scrap of paper folded into the gutter. "There's something tucked here," she said. Her fingers were steady. Elias watched how she worked. Careful index finger tracing the fold, nails short, the precise motion of an assistant who had been taught not to rush. He felt a second shift of emotion. The suspicion eased into focused questioning. When did this arrive? And Marin answered with a quick recitation of the donation invoice and the delivery slip, late afternoon. Unmarked delivery. No donor name outside the lamp pool. The stacks rose in narrow aisles. Elias stood and pushed the cart toward the shelves, the ledger balanced in both hands. The paper's edge left a thin trail of dust on his gloves. In the nearest bay they found 2 adjacent volumes misfiled. Their spines bore the same ledger reference but wrong years. Elias frowned. He ran his finger along a shelf label and then reached for the sealed crate stamped with the same reference. The custodian, arrived at that moment with the echo of rubber soles on concrete. Looked at the crate and then at the ledger. "We should tee open sealed wings without a notice," he said. His voice was low and practical. Elias felt his own certainty bend into practical caution. "This crate bears the same symbol as the ledger," Elias answered. "It could be the rest of the series." "We should cross-check." Marin held the ledger open between them. "There is a folded scrap inside," she said, a name half visible. S face tightened. He checked his ring of keys. Board sent a notice earlier. "Digitize and close this series by Friday." He tapped the delivery notice in his pocket. The notice smelled faintly of printer ink and government glue. Elias saw another emotion arrive: pressure. Pressure from authority shifting the decision from scholarly curiosity into an institutional demand. That pressure changed the stakes. It made the ledger not just an object but a risk. They went back to the table and Elias flattened the scrap. The paper had been pressed and stored, its fold crisp. The scrap carried a last name and half a first name, written in a hurried hand. There was a blot of ink at the margin where the writer's thumb had smudged the letters. Marin traced the smear with the tip of a glove and said, "They left in the middle of the line." They must have been interrupted. Her voice carried the practical cadence of someone who catalogues absence as if it were a property. An external event arrived when retrieved his clipboard and found the crate seal loosened at one corner. He frowned and ran a thumb along the stamp. "This was forced," he said. Elias watched Thumb's mouth set. His suspicion shifted into guarded accusation. Who else had access? Elias, and Thumb answered by naming the roster of night staff. Marin counted them on her breath. The ledger lay between them like a thin, unanswered question. The discussion moved into the stacks. Elias rolled the cart slowly, the lamp attached by a clamp, Shelving labels and spine numbers passed in a steady rhythm. They found other volumes misfiled. A ledger page from 2 years later had been slipped into the wrong book. Those errors suggested hurry or deception. Elias felt a new turn in his thinking. What began as curiosity now required reconstruction of chain and motive. We need Thumb's crate log. We need to trace who handled this trunk after delivery. Thumb's voice hardened. I'll fetch it. Thumb left and returned with a paper ledger of his own. The movement log for crates. He handed it to Elias, who checked names and times. A pattern emerged. A single unnamed entry at 3 in the afternoon the day before, marked only by initials. Thumb read aloud, unlabeled, delivery received. Sign T. He shifted his weight. I didn't sign that. Elias. Marin looked up and asked, could someone forge your mark? Elias set the ledger down and rubbed the crease at his eyebrow. His suspicion deepened into concern for institutional integrity. At the table, Elias unfolded the pressed scrap again and found a note written on the back. The note said, in hurried script, a partial address and a phrase cut off mid-word. Elias' hand trembled once and then steadied. He read the partial name aloud. The halt in the syllable lodged in the room. Marin leaned close. Harrison. Harridge. She offered Hargrove. Elias answered, naming himself despite the oddity. The moment made them all laugh too quietly. Laughter softened, then ended. It was a reminder that names mattered. An unidentified sound came from the corridor, the clank of a late cart. The external event pulled them back to the immediate choices. Elias, if the board sees this gap, they will order immediate closure. We lose context. We lose whatever ledgers paired with this one would tell us, Thom. If we keep it hidden and something comes to light, I'm responsible. Marin met Thom's eyes. The conversation became a quick exchange, 3 short lines of argument. We protect records. Elias, we follow notice. Thom replied, we find the truth. Marin cut in. That rapid back and forth left the question unresolved. Elias felt his role as archivist pressing on him. The ledger was not a specimen but a list of lives. He found his next emotion, resolve. He proposed they fetch the sealed wing inventory to see whether the ledger series had other anomalies. Thumb hesitated, then sighed and said, I'll open it for inspection. One look, his surrender was practical and reluctant. They walked the corridor toward the sealed wing. The metal door bore a stamped placard. Elias had opened similar doors many times in his career. He took out his brass key and checked the teeth. The key on his cord felt lighter than usual. He realized suddenly that his own key was not on the satchel where he always kept it. A new external event, a missing key. He Thumb and Marin. Thumb checked his own ring. He frowned. Mine's here, he said. But his shorter brass key that should have matched Elias' was nowhere to be found. Marin's hands gone still on the ledger. A fresh sense of suspicion moved through the group. Elias' resolve blurred into alarm. Someone moved keys. Someone moved ledgers. That's deliberate. Marin found the cratette's seal and pointed out a faint abrasion where it had been lifted and resealed. The abrasion was a physical detail that shifted the case from accident to deliberate action. Elias felt urgency now. The audit mandate, the misfiled volumes, the torn seam in the crate, and the missing key combined into a concrete chain. They agreed to open the sealed wing despite the notice. They went slow. Them overrode the closure with a code call, and the heavy door hummed. Inside, the air was colder and smelled of beeswax and paper glue. Shelves rose in a disciplined grid. Elias carried the lamp between them, its light catching small motes. Marin moved ahead, hands resting on shelf edges. Every step was an action that registered as a choice to break a rule. They reached the numbered bay and began to search. An external event occurred when they found a space where a ledger should have sat. An empty slot with a torn edge of binding left, as if the volume had been removed in haste. The empty slot made no noise, but it made Elias' breath stop. It's gone. Marin walked the row, running a gloved finger across spines. Thumb checked the inventory against the shelf numbers. The missing ledger was the pivot of the chapter, the absent object that made the final entry matter beyond curiosity. They found, in a locked drawer beneath the shelf, a folded note and a small personal token wrapped in cloth. Thumb lifted the token with 2 fingers and unwrapped it. It was a carved wooden charm, smoothed by handling, with faint initials carved in yesterday's hand. Marin read aloud the initials and then read the note, which stopped his sentence with a blot of fresh ink beside it. Elias' view narrowed. His hands moved to steady the paper, and he felt fear for the ledger's subjects, the people whose names populated its pages. Confrontation followed. Marin demanded they report the absence. Them argued that reporting would bring the board sanctions and possibly destroy the archive's reputation. Elias balanced the two. Marin, if we report now, we bring a search, he said. If we conceal, we might destroy evidence. The discussion became an argument with short lines traded quickly. We must tell them. Marin, we must not alarm the board without proof, countered. We collect proof first. Elias, and what if collecting proof ruins the chain? Shot back. The exchange had 5 short turns. Each name appeared in the lines as required, and each line pushed the decision forward. Elias felt a shift from fear into cautious strategy. He chose to secure the ledger's remaining evidence and to proceed slowly. We will not seal the wing. We will photograph, document, and take the ledger's scrap back to the table. We'll not make a report until we have facts. S jaw tightened, but he agreed. They moved the crate and the leftover pages to the work table. The lamp cast a single pool of light. Elias placed the folded note beside the ledger and smoothed the torn edge of the empty slot across a ruler. He photographed each item with a small digital camera, the shutter clicks filling the quiet. Marin catalogued entries aloud, names, dates, marginalia. Her voice was steady and methodical. Each spoken catalogue entry served as a small act to preserve what the missing page had tried to erase. A mid-chapter cliffhanger arrived when the camera image displayed a smudge that looked like a fingerprint next to the torn margin. Elias leaned closer. The fingerprint was partial, smeared across paper fibers. He called them over and said, "That print is recent." Marin moved closer and reached for a scanner. The discovery forced them into immediate choices. To lock the evidence away, to call the police, or to continue their quiet probe. Elias felt the emotion shift again, from cautious strategy into protective custodianship. Argued for immediate notification. Marin demanded a call to the city records office. The discussion turned to a quick set of practical tasks. Who would secure the crate? Who would sign the chain log? Who would remain with the ledger overnight? They spoke in short practical sentences, names repeated. Elias, you secure the vault door and record the time. Nodded. Marin, you scan the scrap and the note. Marin set the scanner and adjusted the settings. The team moved with clear purpose. They boxed the ledger in acid, free paper, and wrapped the token in muslin. Elias made a physical promise by placing the wrapped ledger into his leather satchel and closing the flap. He felt the leather bite at the satchel's edge and the brass watch against his palm, as if the objects affirmed his decision. The choice to remove the ledger was concrete and irreversible in that moment. He secured the satchel with a brass clasp and then paused, his finger tracing the unfinished line on the copied scan. An unexpected reveal followed when Elias compared the handwriting of the scrap to the ledger's final scrawl. The strokes matched a clerk who had worked in the office nearly a decade earlier, someone Elias remembered by face and by a chipped tooth. That identification changed the story. It suggested not a random donor, but a person with institutional access and knowledge. Elias felt the suspicion harden into a directed theory. He the name aloud. Marin repeated it. Closed his eyes for a beat and then said, "He resigned last year." The detail altered the field of possible motives. In the small hours, they made a choice. They would not call the board that night. They would preserve the ledger, the note, and the token. Elias promised, in the quiet of the lamp, to continue an inquiry at dawn. I will follow this carefully. I owe those names that much. Marin nodded and folded her hands on the table. Replaced the crate seal and recorded the time in his log. Each act stabilized the chapter's end. A decision, a record, a small, deliberate concealment to let truth be found rather than shredded. Elias walked out into the corridor with the satchel at his side. The night air met his face vaguely as he passed the loading dock. He felt responsibility more than triumph. The ledger's last unfinished line sat in his chest as a prompt. He had moved through suspicion, through doubt, through pressure, into choice. The chapter closed by the small, deliberate action he made beneath lamplight. Elias set the satchel on his desk at home, unwrapped the ledger, and with a fingertip traced the unfinished ink stroke once more. He then placed the folded scrap into a small wax envelope and slid it beside the ledger. His final, physical act was to lock the desk drawer and turn the key in the brass lock, the sound of the clicker clear, concrete end to that night's decisions. A brittle scrap slid free from the ledger as Elias held it down, and Marin's hand snapped out to catch the folded page before it hit the table. Suspicion tightened Elias' chest. The scrap bore a hurried date and a name crossed with heavy ink. He did not reach for an explanation. He brushed dust from the ledger's margin with a gloved fingertip and watched Marin's thumb hover over the trailing ink where the last line stopped. The immediate problem lay in that unfinished stroke. Entries halted cleanly, names erased, a date cut off mid-syllable. That concrete irregularity demanded answer before any conjecture could begin. Elias eased the book toward the lamp and set his watch on the table face, upbrass catching the lamplight. He is 58 years old, thin and bent from years over paper, and the ledger had a familiar weight to him. He moved with deliberate care. His index finger traced a column of dates as if reading aloud inside his head. Suspicion shaped each movement. He paused longer over scratched out names. He squared the pages when a margin smear suggested haste. And he folded the scrap open so both he and Marin could see the cramped handwriting, read that aloud, Elias Marin. Her voice was small but sharp. Read the date. He read it. The hand scrawled a civil year, then a name, then a dash and a blur. April 20. First Elias the name. Someone crossed it hard. He turned the scrap so the ink pressed into the fold. The paper had become brittle along the crease. It rasped under his thumb. Marin's eyes flitted to the ledger's edge, then back to Elias. Rowan arrived behind them with a catalogue ledger tucked under his arm. He had come because the reading room phone rang and Marin had asked for help. Rowan set his satchel down and peered at the scrap. That line stops here too, he said, pointing to an entry 2 pages earlier. They began to leaf pages with a practical rhythm. Elias lifted, Marin steadied, Rowan cross, checked the catalogue numbers on the spine labels. Pattern emerged quickly. Several entries ended mid-word. Some names were struck through, other dates had marginal notes erased with the blunt edge of a knife. Elias's suspicion slid toward unease as repetition replaced coincidence. He tapped a page and felt the faint bump where an earlier annotation had been removed. He glanced at Marin, her jaw tightened. He had risen to preserve the truth of ordinary lives. Now that work felt like a wedge between him and the archive's keeper. They called out items to one another in short lines. Here Marin, May 7th, stopped, September 3rd, torn margin, Rowan added, October, strike through Elias. Each line was a small discovery that altered the ledger's pattern. Rowan went to the index and read aloud catalogue accession numbers to see if missing items corresponded to missing entries. There are gaps in accession numbers. Rowan. 3 gaps between entries around this volume's batch. Elias felt the suspicion bend into alarm. Alarm tightened his hands around the page. He folded the ledger more carefully and set a paperweight on the opposite side to keep it open. Keeper Alden arrived 10 minutes later. He entered the reading room with short, purposeful steps and a ledger in hand that was unrelated by number. He did not bother with small courtesies. What is happening here? Alden demanded, looking from the scrap to the open ledger. He already suspected a breach of protocol. Elias answered efficiently. The book holds systematic omissions, he said. Several entries stop or are erased. Alden's face closed. He kept his voice flat. Seal it. Log it. Return it to the restricted shelf. There are institutional reasons for omission you do not need to unsettle tonight. His hand moved toward the ledger. Elias did not make a speech. He slid his satchel a few inches nearer and touched the ledger's spine with both hands. Keeper Alden, this ledger records people. The ledger's job is to keep names whole. We cannot erase those lines and call it preservation. His fingers brushed ink stains on his own fingertips. He felt the old, domestic habit of touching what he'd touched before, a mother's ledger of bills, a neighbor's rent note. And he thought of the ledger as a list of ordinary mornings and small debts. Alden's mouth thinned. Elias, records are managed. Do as you are told. The exchange was short and sharp. Marin interjected. Alden, look at these index gaps. This isn't tea administration. This is omission. Alden's hand tightened on the ledger's cover. Marin, you do not debate the keeper. Rowan stepped forward. He sounded younger and less measured than Elias. Keeper Alden, the catalogue shows removed accession numbers. Someone altered the index. That is not mere management. He held up a hand, drawn slip he'd found behind a row of bound volumes. A removal note stamped and signed with a mark that did not match any keeper's known seal. Alden's eyes flicked to the slip and his jaw went still. He had been the keeper for 18 years. Secrets under his charge would damage more than paperwork. Return that to the archives room, he said now. His voice contained a warning under which the staff had learned to quiet. Elias looked at the slip, then at Alden. For the first time his suspicion stiffened into disbelief. Whose hand is this? He kept his voice low. Marin's lips pressed together. Rowan read the name on the folded scrap aloud. It is addressed to someone on Argyle Street, he said. Elias, you used to live near Argyle. Elias' eyes narrowed. The personal stake revealed itself in a single line of handwriting. The address matched a household he remembered from childhood, a narrow house where a woman had once mended shirts by lamplight. The ledger's silence felt suddenly private, not institutional. Suspicion shifted to urgency. They moved from table to stacks. Elias followed the list of accession numbers Rowan read aloud. Each missing number began to feel deliberate. He thumbed through a catalogue book and found empty slots where accession numbers had been excised. He ran a finger along the binding of the catalogue and felt a recently disturbed dust line. Someone took things out, Rowan. Someone made the ledger stop on purpose. He had begun to pace in a tight, quick line between the stacks. Marin found a hidden shelf behind leather-bound volumes and reached in. She drew out a folded note in a hand Elias recognized. The handwriting matched the scrap. He touched the fold and felt his pulse click in his throat. Elias, Marin softly, this is a household you once mentioned in a talk to students years ago. The name is the same. That revelation moved action into the private. Elias' chest lengthened with a new, tangible pressure. He had always kept the ledger and its voices separate from his own life. Now the ledger's omission crossed into streets he had walked, shops he had known. The morning when his mother shut a gate and did not return right away because she had stopped to speak with a neighbor. He turned to Rowan. Photograph these pages, he said. Copy the scrap. Keep the original here but make a discreet duplicate. We'll trace that address. Rowan nodded and reached for his camera. Marin wrapped her gloved hand around the folded scrap to steady it. The three of them moved with a single, practical momentum. Keeper Alden reappeared at the mouth of the stacks before they had time to set up a lamp for copying. His palms were flat against his coat. He spoke quickly. You will not remove the ledger from its area. You will not circulate copies without authorization. Bring that scrap. His insistence sounded like command. Elias replied, Alden, we reproduce records all the time for research. We will make a copy now and file it through proper channels. Alden's eyes narrowed. Proper channels means I inspect the request and approve it. Not this. Not tonight. His tone shifted from bureaucratic to raw. He moved forward and reached for the ledger. Elias braced his shoulder against the table. What followed was a short scuffle that began with Alden's hand reaching and Elias' wrist closing around the cover. Give it here, Alden. Elias, let go. Elias held the book. Marin stepped between them with a small, steadying voice. Alden, stop. This is not how to handle records. Rowan set the camera down and raised his hands. Alden, listen. The index is wrong. We need time to examine. There were rapid exchanges now. Elias, step back. Alden, you are not taking this away. Marin, lower your voice. Rowan, call the registrar. Each line clipped the air. The altercation was physical and brief. Alden's palm slid under the book. Elias tightened his grip. The ledger bent under the pressure, and the open page folded in a way that exposed the unfinished line to the lamp. Ink flecked the margin where a knuckle had pressed. For a sliver of time the ledger lay open to the incomplete sentence, and the folded scrap flattened under the weight of hands. The presence of witnesses increased the chapter's intensity. Someone in the corridor knocked. Footsteps paced past the reading room window. The scuffle ended when Alden, lips tight, withdrew with the intention of control rather than force. He left the ledger where it had fallen and spun back toward the office, his cane clicking on the floor tile as he went. Elias released his hold and exhaled through his nose. His emotions shifted again. Alarm receded into steady resolve. He had a copy of the scrap tucked into his palm by then. A discreet fold of paper he had slipped into his satchel while the keeper argued with the registrar by phone. They set the ledger on the table with cautious hands and arranged the lamp for copying. Rowan took 3 photographs, each careful shot calibrated to show the ink strokes, the paper texture, the torn edge. Marin annotated the marginalia with a thin pencil, writing catalog numbers and page references. Her pencil tip made small, exact marks. Elias watched them do the mechanical work of evidence, gathering, and felt his decision coalesce. He would follow this omission beyond the archive's walls if he needed to. He felt the old ache of responsibility that had first led him to archives. Common lives needed names. He closed his mouth against a speech that would either accuse or inflame. Alden returned once more, slower, and with the registrar at his shoulder. The registrar's face was placid, but his hands were empty. Elias, the institution asks you to leave the ledger for now. Misplaced redaction can threaten ongoing inquiries, Elias answered. Registrar, you must understand. These are people. The ledger isn't a case file for convenience. It is a record of lives. We cannot let names disappear from paper and from memory. The registrar's reply was procedural. We will examine. For now, file a request. Do not remove original materials. Elias met the registrar's even tone and then looked at Marin. She nodded once and folded the copied scrap into a small envelope. Their movements were precise and deliberate. Copy, envelope, satchel. Outside, the street glowed in slow pools of lamplight. Elias should have closed the ledger and returned it to its shelf, but he kept the discreet copy inside his satchel. He slipped the satchel strap over his shoulder. Marin reached for his sleeve and touched him with 2 fingers. Elias, she said, you are not taking this alone. He felt a shift in the room's energy then. Suspicion and alarm had become a shared resolve. Elias straightened. He met Alden's eyes. Keeper Alden, I will file the form by morning, but I will also follow the address. If someone erased a name tied to Argyle Street, I will see why. Alden's mouth tightened, and he did not answer. They closed the ledger carefully and set a brass clasp over it, though not fastened, more to keep the book's place than to lock its pages. Rowan and Marin logged the incident in shortened. Times, names, the missing accession numbers. Professional routine returned like muscle memory. After they finished, the reading room fell into a quieter order. Elias traced the incomplete sentence with a fingertip one last time, pressing into the ink ridge. He felt a small, physical tremor in his hand, the same twitch he'd learned to hide when a page had broke a long, guarded story. Then he turned the clasp of his satchel once, twice, and stepped toward the archive doorway. At the threshold he hesitated. The fog outside pooled against the lamplight, cool and wet on his face. He slipped the copied scrap into the satchel's inner pocket and felt the paper's crisp edge. He closed the door behind him and the latch clicked. The final act of the chapter is simple and concrete. Elias set his brass watch and checked the time, then crossed the threshold into the street with the satchel secure. He would begin at Argyle Street, find the household named in the handwriting, and ask questions of people who had kept each other's receipts, debts, and small confessions for years. He would not promise a neat resolution. He promised instead a sequence of practical actions. Locate the house, speak to neighbors, compare ledger notes. He pulled his coat tight and walked into the fog, the copied scrap flat against his chest like a map to a missing name. Memory from the ledger's first mid-sentence, Marin's startled sound, and the ledger's abrupt stop, followed him into the street. The sound repeated in his head not as a metaphor, but as a precise echo of what had happened at the table. He kept his pace even and his shoulders squared. He had moved through suspicion, through alarm, and into measured decision. Tonight he would trace the erased name to a doorbell, a doorstep, a person who could say whether a name had been removed by accident or design. He stepped deeper into the fog, and the next chapter of his search began with the concrete act of crossing Argyle's dim sidewalk and lifting a knuckle to a wooden door. Elias' last motion in the archive was to close the reading room's door behind him. The latch clicked once, then again when he checked it from the outside. He put his hand into his satchel, felt the folded scrap, and pressed it flat. The ledger remained on the table inside, open to the unfinished line. A lamp threw a small pool of light over the page. Elias did not look back. He tightened his satchel strap and moved away, his breath visible, his feet steady, determined to follow a paper trace the archive refused to explain. Maren's thumb froze over the ledger where the ink stopped mid-line, and she let out a short, sharp breath that pulled Elias forward. Suspicion tightened Elias Hargrove's chest into a small, precise knot. He reached and laid a gloved fingertip on the trailing ink, as if the page might still be warm. He nothing at first. He did not want to break the motion that might reveal what had been withheld. He brushed the page edge with his thumbnail and the action made a sound. Paper against cloth. That sound made the problem concrete. The ledger had stopped mid-sentence and someone had left a space that demanded explanation. Elias moved the lamp closer with his left hand and kept his right on the page. He had worked in archives long enough to read absence as easily as presence. He smelled beeswax and old glue and the faint pipe tobacco clinging to his coat. He saw the index fingers of his gloves marked with tiny lines of ink. That detail mattered. Small stains told him who handled what. Maren cleared her throat. Look at the date. Elias read the date aloud, it with steady cadence. June 2nd, 1892. The month made him press his watch chain between thumb and forefinger. The ledger gave facts and withheld the finish. The central problem sat on the table. The record ended, but someone had been keeping it. They folded the brittle scrap together as if it were an accusation. Maren's hands moved with a conservator's care. She unfastened a wax-sealed bundle from her belt and set it beside the lamp. The scrap slid out, creased at a corner. Elias took the scrap with 2 fingers. The scrap carried a hurried date and a name that had been crossed with heavy ink. Who crosses a name like that? Elias. His voice kept its quiet edge, but the word carried accusation. Maren tapped the crossed letters with the tip of a glove. Someone who wanted this erased. Both men felt the suspicion shift toward intent. That shift changed how Elias touched the binding. He moved from curiosity to a quieter, sharper drive. He must prove whether erasure had been official. Footsteps came from the corridor, measured and purposeful. Alden stood framed in the doorway with his overcoat still on and his hands tucked where he could hide them. He looked at the table, at the ledger, at Elias. Alden's training in administration showed in his posture. Neat, contained, practiced. Close it. Seal the volume. Protocol. Elias did not stand. He lifted his chin. We found a torn page. Elias the words plainly. Alden's eyes moved to the scrap, then away. Catalogue decisions are not made at a lamp, Maren added. There are annotations nearby, sir. Alden stepped into the lamplight and checked his watch. Then we log it and remove it to secure storage. Elias pushed his chair back slowly. I will not hand it over until I understand why names disappear. The word disappear tightened the air. Alden's face did not redden. His voice lost its smoothness. Elias had turned suspicion into a demand. The first emotion shift arrived. Suspicion flared into anger. Elias spoke with a low temper that made Alden hesitate. Alden's hand went to the ledger as if he could assert ownership by touch. Elias moved his shoulder into the table and said, "You will not take it, Alden." Alden's jaw set. "Elias," he said, and the single name functioned as a command. "This is institutional property, Elias, so are its records. We are the stewards, not the censors. Maren, if names are crossed out and people are moved without record, that is a preservation problem." Alden's fingers brushed the paper. Nothing else for a long breath. Lilla came then, carrying a narrow box of repaired bindings and the smell of starch on her hands. She crouched to peer under the table and then rose, her eyes catching the lamp. Leela speaks with clipped efficiency. There are marginal notes in adjacent volumes. The voice added a new direction. Suspicion became investigation. They worked through the stacks in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Elias led with a lamp and a list. Marin and Lila moved between shelves with gloves and soft cloths. They compared dates and hands. In the next set of volumes, they found a short marginal list bound in a different hand. It began with ordinary entries, then stopped in the same sequence as the ledger. Someone had marked several names as transferred or removed. Each mark had a small note beside it in a small, tight script. Alias read the list aloud. He transferred to warehouse. Removed from rolls, he touched one note and felt the paper's roughness. He who writes like that in a public ledger? Lila answered, an administrator who needed plausible paperwork. Marin pointed to the pattern. The sequence matches the ledger's stops. Look here and here. Elias found the link concrete in ink and margin. The suspicion shifted a second time. Doubt, clarity. What had been an isolated absence now read as a pattern of erasure. Elias' hands tightened on the lamp handle. He felt anger again, but the anger was sharpened by a new determination to document the removal. They returned to the table carrying the marginal list and 4 adjacent volumes. Alden waited in the doorway with his coat buttoned. You have enough for a report. Seal it. Elias laid the marginal notes on the ledger and said, this is not neutral. These marks change lives. Alden's shoulders tightened. Marin, several names stop on the ledger at the same point the marginal list marks them transferred. Alden's mouth thinned. Some transfers are administrative. You are making a case without context. Elias met Alden's eyes. Context is in the ledger. The ledger stopped midline. That is not administrative shorthand, Alden. It is an omission with force. The argument moved from policy to possession. Conversation sped into an exchange of lines. Elias, you close records. People vanish from the rolls. Alden, you accuse me of erasure. Elias, I accuse whoever signed those notes. They paced like 2 men circling a table at night. The room felt smaller because choices now pressed like hands on paper. The confrontation had to produce an external change. They argued through 3 short paragraphs of heated lines until the ledger slid on its cloth and fell. The fall made a single, audible thump that cut into their voices. The lamp rocked. The pages fanned. A loose, damp sheet dropped free from between leaves and settled face up on the table. Elias saw a single name written in a hurried hand and an unfinished address. A chestnut row opposite the sentence ended with a stub of a dash and nothing beyond. Alden's hand shot forward. Give it to me. Elias lunged faster. The 2 men grabbed at the paper. Leela and Marin moved in to block Alden. Voices snapped in quick, clipped dialogue. Alden, stop. Marin, Leela, take the page. Leela, I will photograph it. Alden, no photographs. Chain of custody. Elias, we do not shred evidence in front of witnesses. Alden, you are obstructing institutional procedure. Elias, you are removing a primary record with bare hands. The scuffle increased into a scramble. Hands skinned the paper edge. The torn page crumpled slightly. Someone's glove left a damp smear of oil on the ink. The physical fight made the stakes concrete. It was no longer argument about principles. It was struggle for custody of a document that could prove deliberate erasure. The energy rose to the chapter's single climax. The lights failed then. The blackout came with a mechanical click, and the emergency strips hummed weakly at the ceiling. Lamplight slashed the table in thin pools and then jittered. Silence fell heavy for a breath. In that dark, the strained motion of bodies made hurried, low sounds. Alden's knees bumped the table. Elias felt a shove against his shoulder. He heard Marin's breath like a small intake. Leela's voice cut through the dim. The torn page, a hand grabbed the paper and a new flash of motion followed. Elias lunged and his fingers closed on the edge of the page. At the same time Alden's palm came down. They held the page together and their hands slipped. The torn corner folded over and the unfinished address revealed another name in a different ink beneath the top line. Elias saw the name and his breath stopped in equipment, like clack behind his ribs. It matched the name that had been crossed out on the brittle scrap they had examined earlier. That single discovery changed who he suspected. Elias did not speak at first. He felt his chest move with a sharp, physical reaction. He steadied his grip and said, "Leela," read the lower name. Leela leaned in and whispered the name, Anna Swaith. Marin's hand went flat on the table. That is the name on the scrap, crossed out." Alden's fingers tightened. "Where did you find that?" "Elias, it came free from the ledger when it fell." Voices became harder and faster. "Alden, then it is property of the institution, Elias. Then the institution must answer why Anna Swaith leaves the ledger mid-line." The twist settled between them. The crossed-out scrap and the torn page belonged to the same person. Whoever had crossed the scrap had also left an unfinished address in the ledger. The implication was precise and damning. Someone had tried to remove Anna from the record, not only in ink but in the ledger itself. The emergency lights stabilized, but they cast everything in hard, flat white. Alden breathed through his teeth. Protocol requires we seal and report." "Elias, protocol also requires a proper chain and transparency." Alden's voice sharpened. "You are creating alarm." "We will close the reading room." Elias spread his palms on the table and met Alden's steady gaze. You will not walk away with that page." "Not tonight." His voice held a new resolve. The emotion shift here was palpable. Fear flickered in Elias when the lights died, then smoothed into steady resolve as he chose to keep the record. He placed the torn page under his palm and did not let go. Alden drew back and called down the corridor. His voice had the authority of someone practiced at making code words work. "Security to the archive." "Seal the room." Marin slid a notebook across the table. "She'd record whatever you see, Elias." Date, time, hands present. Elias opened the notebook and began a slow, careful transcription. He wrote the ledger's final fragment exactly as it appeared, and then copied the torn fragment line by line. He wrote the name Anna Swaith in full and the unfinished address. He felt his pen leave tiny black dots on his fingers. Each dot was a small oath. "I will carry this copy if they will not, Lila. If they seal the ledger, you must have proof outside the archive." Elias nodded. His actions turned the tension into documentation. The fight over custody reframed into a strategy to preserve the facts. Security arrived within 4 measured steps and an apologetic badge. 2 men in service coats entered, their faces neutral. They stood at the threshold and Alden gave them the ledger's serial number. One security man reached for the ledger and then paused. "We will log it now," he said. Alden's shoulders relaxed with a small, controlled motion. "Good, Alden." He did not look at Elias when he added, "This is settled." Elias did not answer. He slid his handwritten copy into a small journal and closed it. He then folded the torn scrap and tucked it into his satchel. The 2 moves were deliberate. Elias did not need words to mark his decision. He had made a private custody of the ledger's last traces. That action set the next beat: institutional procedure versus individual preservation. In the corridor later, Alden arranged a formal notice and stamps. He moved with administrative rhythms that smoothed the room's rough edges. He to the staff, "All access suspended until the review." "Marin, who will review?" Alden did not answer directly. "I will consult the board," Leela muttered. "The board often prefers to avoid scandal." Elias did not speak, but he watched how Alden folded paper and handled seals. He noticed when Alden hesitated over the ledger's serial number, the way his fingers covered the final digits for a moment. That little concealment suggested motive beyond routine. Elias stored the detail. He had trained himself to trust small hesitations more than loud declarations. They left the reading room in a tight, ineffective line. Outside, the night had the thin, steady hush of a city that sleeps poorly. Elias walked with his satchel against his hip and felt the weight of the scrap. He did not talk. Marin fell into step beside him and said, "You copied it exactly." Elias held out his journal and she inspected the writing. "Fine work." "Careful." Leela fell behind with an index print of the dragged marginal list. "I have photographs." Elias looked at both of them and said, "We will not let paper be the only witness." He spoke quietly, almost as if reminding himself. The group decided to meet later in Elias's study. They arranged a time and a plan. The plan included names, actions, and next moves. They would not rely on trusted channels. Back in his study, Elias set the lamp on a small wooden desk and unfastened his watch chain before he opened the journal. He kept his fingers steady. He copied the ledger's unfinished line into a private page and then, with a trimmer he controlled, slipped the torn scrap into his satchel. He set the satchel by the door and locked the study's outer bolt. The emotion in him changed again. The night's anger became a quiet, guarded sorrow for those people removed without notice. He had a precise grief, not a vague sadness. He grieved the loss of recorded lives. He laid out the marginal list beside the journal and compared the sequence again. He mapped the transfer notes to addresses where he could. The mapping revealed a pattern of small wards and storage facilities where names left the public record. Each match hardened his conviction that erasure had been systemic. Elias thought of Anna Swaith and of the crossed scrap Marin had found. He repeated the name aloud and then stopped. The room was small, a chair, a shelf, the faint smell of beeswax. He closed his eyes for one measured beat and then opened them to the page he had written. He read his own handwriting. It looked like evidence that might survive his hands. He put the journal in his satchel and slid the strap over his shoulder. He planned the next day. He would take the copied line to the municipal rolls and compare microfilm. He would ask about Chestnut Row. He would not announce his charge openly. He would test the traces in public records. The choice changed the chapter's direction from preservation to public verification. The next morning, Elias went to the municipal records office 2 blocks from the archive. He presented himself as a researcher and requested microfilm for Chestnut Row, 19th century censuses, and warehouse transfers. The clerk at the counter looked at his badge, then at the ledger image he produced. The clerk said, "We need authorization, Elias. I'll wait." He took a seat and thumped the satchel lightly with his cane. He folded his hands and let the clerk dance through forms. An hour later the clerk returned with a small reel of film. Elias carried it to a reading booth and threaded it with steady hands. He found Chestnut Row entries and then he found gaps. Names stopped in those rolls in the same sequence he had seen in the ledger. The gaps had been stamped, transferred in a hand that matched the marginal notes. Elias leaned forward. His breath fogged the glass. The photographic record made the absence mechanical. The twist hardened. Erasure moved from local ledger to municipal compliance. Elias called Marin and then Lila. He spoke in quick, precise lines. "I have microfilm. The transfers show similarly. Marin, bring the copies. Meet at the alley behind the archive at dusk," Lila added. "I can show you the photographs." The meeting plan used small, specific meeting places and careful times. Elias liked such plans. He packed his satchel and put the brass key on the cord inside his waistcoat. He walked back to the archive with an intentional slow pace. He felt the weight of responsibility settle like a physical thing against his collarbone. He breathed in and out and counted steps. Each step was an action to carry the evidence forward. At dusk they met behind the archive, between the brick wall and a low-service door. They passed documents in a single, deliberate motion. Lila spread the photographs on a crate, and Marin laid the marginal list beside them. Elias pulled out his journal and set the copied line where anyone could read it. The 3 of them bent over the small pool of lamplight that fell from a street lamp. The evidence was immediate now. Ledger fragment, torn page, marginal notes, and microfilm gaps. "Lila, this is enough to force a review." "Elias, it should be publicized." Marin shook her head. If we go public without care, the board will claim mishandling." Elias answered. "Then we document more. We find names and addresses." Debate turned on tactics. The room's tension returned, but it was now directed at planning rather than immediate conflict. They arranged to visit Chestnut Row at dawn. The address on the torn page was unfinished, but the street and block gave them a start. Elias insisted they proceed quietly and in pairs. We watch, we photograph, we compare." Lila pressed her camera into his hand and said, "You take this. Keep it. Avoid visible badges." The plan had urgency and prudence. The emotion in Elias moved again. Resolve deepened into careful, steady resolve. He walked the empty streets at first light and found the row of houses where Chestnut Row once stood. The map showed a warehouse in the lot that now held a low brick building and a stenciled sign, "Public Storage." Elias' hand tightened on the camera strap. He took photographs from the lane, careful not to be conspicuous. At Public Storage, he asked for records. The clerk said, "Records are off-site." "You will need a subpoena." Elias did not have proof for a subpoena. He had only ink, scrap, and his own copy. He left the office and sat on a bench with sunlight cutting a small rectangle on his knee. He called Alden's office and left a message requesting a meeting to discuss transfer policies. Alden responded later with a curt time and a place. Boardroom, 9 a.m. Elias accepted. The summons felt like an attempt to lure him into formality. He recognized the risk. He prepared his notes and photographs and made a copy of the torn page. He folded the copy carefully and slipped it into a separate pocket. In the boardroom, the door was heavy and the chairs smelled of polish. Alden sat at the head of the long table with 2 board members present. Elias entered with his satchel and his journal. He set the copied ledger lines on the polished wood and slid the microfilm stills across. Alden did not look surprised. He looked composed, as though he had expected the rehearsal. "You brought this to formal review." "Elias, I brought proof that names listed as transferred match ledger stops and municipal gaps. Marin and Lilla were absent." Elias presented alone. Alden replied, "If transfers were recorded for administrative reasons, that explains the gaps." Elias pushed the torn page forward. He explained why Anna Swaith's address stops mid-line. Alden's fingers paused at the paper's edge. Anna Swaith was registered as transferred under a separate program. Elias, that program was not announced in our rolls. The exchange narrowed into a small, precise suppressive logic. Origin of the transfers mattered more than form. Alden's face tightened for the first time in public. Some transfers were part of a relocation for safety and labor allocation. Elias, who authorized the program. Alden, the board and municipal orders. Elias pressed, "Where are notices? Where are receipts? Where is Anna Swaith now?" Silence followed. Alden looked at the board members and said nothing more. The room's tension shifted into pressure. Elias felt the third emotion shift as the pattern of institutional closure moved him from resolve into a cold, steady indignation. He could feel the arc of his decisions: document, verify, confront. He would now add pressure on officials and seek witnesses who could speak to transfers. After the boardroom, Elias returned to the archive where Marin awaited with a list of names she had found in parish ledgers. Leela arrived late and delivered a surprise. A ledger stub from an outside collection that recorded a shipment of persons to a municipal warehouse on the exact date Anna's entry stopped. The stub contained a clerical stamp and the initials of an administrator Elias recognized from the marginal notes. He allowed the initials and Marin repeated them. Alden's handwriting differs, but these initials match the marginal list. Elias folded the stub and tucked it into his satchel. The twist now was broader. Paper trails connected across institutions and suggested coordinated removal. It was not the action of one clerk. It was the work of a system. They planned outreach to a retired clerk who had kept personal notes. Elias had met the clerk years earlier at a preservation seminar. He went to find him at a small pensioners' lodging. The man remembered ledger handling and the phrase "transferred" used in a cautious tone. We were told to mark some names as transferred when moving problematic cases." He ate a biscuit and then added, "I hid one name on a scrap because the ledger's end looked wrong to me." Elias handed him the folded scrap and asked if he recognized the name. The man squinted, then nodded. Anna Swaith. She came from the east side. The order smelled like wartime adjustments. The retired clerk's recollection placed the practice in a historical frame. It made the removal procedural, not random. That new understanding required them to place motive inside policy and not only in individual malice. Elias then confronted Alden one last time in the corridor with the retired clerk's testimony and the outside ledger stub. Alden's composure faltered. The municipal orders were not for Eresha. They were for relocation in volatile seasons. Elias, Relocation must be recorded and families notified. Alden, many cases were urgent. Notices could cause panic. Elias, panic does not authorize secrecy or the crossing out of names. Alden lowered his voice. You do not understand the pressures at the time. Decisions were made to preserve order, Elias answered. Order preserved by erasing people from public record is not preservation. Their confrontation turned public policy into moral terms. It forced Alden to choose whether to defend the ledger's silence as oversight or as a policy of disappearance. Alden hesitated and then offered a compromise. A closed review by the board with witnesses from the archive staff. Elias accepted provisionally but insisted on independent oversight. If this is to be reviewed, the ledger must remain accessible to certified historians and the press when cleared. Alden replied with a small, conditioned laugh. You are asking for publicity, Elias nothing. He folded his arms and felt the last tightness of the chapter unwind into a new task. To move the ledger's silence into public record. He left Alden in the corridor with the board's offer and walked back to his study to copy yet another line. That night Elias sat again at his desk and wrote the ledger's last phrase into his private journal. He copied marginal notes and the torn page as unfinished address, word for careful word. He dated his entry and stamped it with a small notation he used for urgent irregularities. He slid the journal into his satchel and wrapped the torn scrap in a folded handkerchief. He clipped the brass key back into place on its cord and checked the pocket watch's face once more. Outside, a cart rattled past. He stood and turned out the lamp. The final beat was a concrete action. He closed the study door and bolted it from within, then placed his satchel in the bottom drawer and latched it shut. The last paragraph ends on an action. Elias tucks his copied line into the satchel, snaps the brass watch shut, and turns out the lamp before closing the study door.